to the May 2020 Royal Historical Society Public Lecture. I'm Margot Finn, the President of the Society, and with a great pleasure to be introducing our speaker, Professor Sarah Hamilton of the University of Exeter. For 5 years, Sarah served as the Honorary Treasurer of the Society, and it's in no small part thanks to her careful stewardship of our finances that this week we were able to launch a programme of hardship funding for early career researchers in the UK. But it's in her capacity as a first-rate medieval historian, rather than for her fiscal skills, that we've invited her to give you this lecture. It begins with the murder of Thomas Becket in the 12th century and takes into its scope, inter alia, murders and violent assaults, such as the death connived at by a bishop and his mother, another murder that was precipitated by an ill-advised seeking plan. And in the course of these events, there's much splashing about of holy water and many liturgical developments. I do hope that you'll enjoy and learn from this lecture as much as I did. You'll be able to participate in the virtual question and answer as well.
Hello, I'm going to talk to you about responses to violence, liturgy, authority and sacred places between 900 and 1150. The murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, in his own cathedral on the 29th of December in 1170 led to the closure of the church and the suspension of all liturgical services there for almost a year. Services, in fact, only resumed some 357 days later on the 21st of December 1171. The church building itself needed to be ritually cleansed and restored from the violence and violation which had taken place within it. It was only, as one of the biographers of Becket, writing within a decade or so of his death, recorded, on the third day before the Lord's Nativity, the Church of Canterbury was reconciled and permission to celebrate its offices granted to the monks by apostolic authority. It took so long to reopen the church because advice and permission about what to do in such circumstances was sought from the Pope. The letter he wrote to his two legates on the subject has been preserved and it's worth quoting. We entrust to you how you are to reconcile the Church of Canterbury. Thus the sacrament of the original dedication ought not to be repeated, but just as it is the custom to do in the Church of Blessed Peter, blessed water should be splashed about. The papal legates therefore wrote to the prior and the community of Christ Church, which served the cathedral, instructing them to call all the abbots and bishops of their province to a solemn assembly so that they could consecrate your church anew. And in a service conducted by Bartholomew, Bishop of Exeter, and attended by all the leading churchmen of southern England, the cathedral church where Becket had been cut down was, in the words of one later chronicler, restored to its pristine state on the feast of Becket's namesake, St. Thomas the Apostle. Becket's murder was shocking. It was also highly unusual. The texts I've just cited were all written close to the event and give the impression that what took place on the 21st of December 1171 was an unusual, even innovative rite. Advice was sought by the legates from the Pope as to what should be done. The Pope prescribed not only that the church should be reconciled, but how the rite should be conducted with the asperging of holy water as in the Church of Rome. This impression of novelty is strengthened by the variation in the vocabulary used by different writers to describe the service. They variously describe it using the verbs to restore or reform, reformare, to reconcile, reconciliare, and to consecrate, consecrare. But in fact, a rite for the reconciliation of altars or sacred places or cemeteries where blood has been spilt or homicide committed or some other public filthiness or perhaps superstition. The Latin is ambiguous, has been perpetrated. That sort of rite is to be found in bishops' service books associated with 12th century Canterbury, like this one currently in Trinity College, Dublin. Now, it's distinctly possible that this rite was the basis for that used by Bartholomew of Exeter, for this rite, as we shall see, had already been a staple of English service books and church law for over 2 centuries. All those involved, the Pope, his 2 legates, Bishop Bartholomew of Exeter, Prior Oddo of Christ Church, Canterbury, and the assembled bishops and abbots, as I will show, are therefore likely to have already been familiar with this rite. For it is the history of this rite for the reconciliation of those sacred places where blood has been spilt, which is my subject. But first, a few words about the challenges that liturgical texts pose, like this rite, pose for historians. Until recently, the attitude of most medievalists to liturgy was akin to that of the psychiatrist Sir Roderick Goslar in P.G. Woodhouse's stories about Bertie Wooster. To him is attributed this view: a lay interest in matters to do with liturgical procedure is invariably a prelude to insanity. But liturgical manuscripts like these 3 are amongst the most plentiful sorts of text to survive from the 10th and 11th centuries. They survive as both entire codices and even more plentifully as fragments, preserved in later medieval and early modern book bindings or as wrappings for records. They're also universal across the Christian Latin West, and it's liturgy's ubiquity and formulaic nature which make it attractive as a form of evidence, because it allows comparison of attitudes across time and across space for what liturgy can reveal about ecclesiastical thought, aspirations, and, as I shall argue, practice. But it's that very ubiquity which also makes liturgical texts tricky to use as historical evidence. And this, I think, helps to explain their scholarly neglect. Liturgy, by its very nature, aspires to be timeless and ahistorical, to experience God in the present through the reenactment of events from both the biblical past and more recent Christian history. At the same time, in commemorating the Christian past through feasts of saints, for example, that interest led to regional and local diversity, as each religious community created and preserved its own identity and history through its own calendar and service books, setting out which saints were to be remembered, on which days, and how particular rites should be conducted. I propose, therefore, to confine my investigation here to the history of this rite for the reconciliation of sacred places where blood has been spilt to the Canterbury province of southern England. My intention is not so much to provide a context for the events after Becket's murder, but rather to use the history of this rite to cast light on 2 related issues. First, the emergence of the idea of the physical church as a separate and sacred space, and secondly, the growth in the central medieval conception of the office of bishop as a figure who combined ecclesiastical and secular authority together at the local level. Research by French, American and British historians across the last 3 decades has identified the period from the 9th to the 11th century as a crucial time for the development of local churches across the Latin Christian West. Central to this development is the emergence and spread of parochial structures, like this one at Stowe in Lincolnshire, the erection and maintenance of local churches funded by the nobility and by those living in the locality. And alongside this growth in local church buildings came a shift in where the dead were buried. Between the 7th and 12th centuries, the dead moved from their traditional Roman location outside the city walls to be situated in cemeteries close to or around or next to the local church. And this change in the local church is accompanied by a change in the understanding of the term ecclesia. In the late antiquity, the term denoted a community of the faithful, but it came in this period to denote a particular enclosed space, sacred space, set apart from the secular world. Dominic Iona Pratt found the origins of this spatial term in the writings of 9th century Carolingian churchmen. The idea of the church as a separate, sacred space was first fully worked out and developed in this Frankish world of the 9th century. And at the same time, the definition of church was expanded beyond the building in which the worship took place to include cemeteries, the priest's house, and his lands. And this sort of change in and codification of what is meant by ecclesia changed the understanding of church buildings, so they became not just places reserved for worship, but also places separated from and set apart from the secular world, symbolising the community of the living and the dead, but also offering a place of refuge from secular law. And this change was marked by the emergence in Francia of liturgical rites for the consecration of churches from the 7th century onwards, and their consolidation in the 9th century. And then you get rites for the consecration specifically of cemeteries in the course of the 10th century. And it was these rites which not only marked but made these ecclesiastical spaces sacred and set apart from the secular. And this manuscript that you see here is an 11th century manuscript where you've got a depiction of the bishop leading that process of dedication, church dedication and consecration. Research on the office of bishops has similarly traced the origins of their late medieval status to the writings of 9th century churchmen. How and when both developments took place in Anglo-Saxon England is, however, much less well understood. Although the rite for the reconciliation of holy places has not been noticed by researchers, either on Francia, by which I mean modern-day France, Germany, the Low Countries, or England, it has a good deal to tell us about how, when, and why these changes came about. So in what follows, I'll start by outlining the evidence for this liturgical rite. I'll then go on to consider how far we should interpret liturgical evidence by uncovering how the rite evolved between the time it was first recorded in the early 10th century and the mid-12th century. In the third section, I trace when and how this particular liturgical response to violent attacks taking place in consecrated ecclesiastical buildings and sites came to be recorded in church law, and how far that change in law corresponds with developments in liturgy. And finally, having worked out where and when this rite emerged, I'll investigate the wider context in which it first appeared asking why it was recorded when it was and what that can tell us about the development of ecclesiastical thought. Okay. We can't be sure which rite was used by Bishop Bartholomew to reconcile Canterbury Cathedral, but the Magdalen Pontifical, a manuscript now numbered 226 in the Library of Magdalen College, Oxford, is one of a group of manuscripts associated with Canterbury copied in the mid-12th century, and so the rite it contains is pretty proximate to the events of December 1171. And the rite in the Magdalen manuscript has the following stages. It begins with bishop, clergy and people processing in front of the church, singing an antiphon from Psalm 76. Thy way, O God, is in the holy place. Who is the great God like our God? Followed by two prayers in which they request that the Lord put demons to flight and purify the minds of those present. They then enter the church singing the antiphon, Peace be in this house and on all its inhabitants. And that's followed by episcopal prayer. The text then specifies that the clergy should recite the same litany as required in the dedication rite for an altar. And the bishop then makes the exorcism. He blesses salt, ashes, water and wine as for the rite for altar dedication. And that's followed by a prayer requesting the reconciliation of this holy place or cemetery and that it be consecrated or perpetually remain consecrated. Afterwards, the bishop processes around the church or cemetery 3 times on the inside and 3 times outside, i.e. outside the walls, sprinkling blessed water and singing another antiphon. Thou wilt sprinkle me, O Lord, with hyssop, and I shall be cleansed. The prayers which follow request that the place be cleansed, restored and rebuilt, that this place will be purged of all pollution, sanctified and restored to its prior state, and reconciled as sacred. That God, whose benevolence has neither beginning nor end, hear our prayers to cleanse that which is polluted, restore that which is neglected, rebuild that which is damaged. The bishop then goes round the church or the inside and to the doors and to the cemetery with incense, while singing another antiphon and psalm, and requests that the church or the cemetery be sanctified as it had first been sanctified, and requests blessing and forgiveness of sins, both for those who come into the oratory and for those who are buried in the cemetery. So for the community of both the living and the dead associated with that church. And the bishop then comes back into the church singing another psalm and antiphon. Again, these are ones that you find in the dedication of the church rite. And he should bless the altar and commend the holy place to the Lord, requesting that all wickedness in the future be eliminated from this place. And again, the prayers which accompany this penultimate stage use language of restoration and cleansing. And that procession rite, if you like, is followed immediately by a solemn mass. And for that solemn mass, 2 readings are specified. They include the passage from the book of Revelation about seeing a holy city, a new Jerusalem coming down out of the heavens, and that from Luke, in which Christ asserted that his Father's house is built upon rock. So the prayers and the readings continue these themes of cleansing and contamination, but they also make this very concrete link between the church, which has been consecrated anew, and the house of God, the New Jerusalem. So as this summary makes clear, this rite is based on the assumption that the church building has previously been made holy, but that holiness has been contaminated by a violent act. Therefore, the language used throughout is that of disease and pollution. Words like sordium, filth, contagion of sin, culpa contagi, taint, maculatum, pollution, polluzione. This is a state which can only be rectified by cleansing and exorcism. So the rite continually makes reference to and repeats elements from the rite for the original dedication of the church. And we see this in the cross-references around various elements, the recitation of the litany, the exorcism, the blessing of the altar. This rite is also a very public one. It's a collective one. It begins outside the church with a procession led by the bishop, but also involving the clergy and people. Although the minister is the bishop, the text of the prayers repeatedly emphasize the collective nature of the service. The deacon instructs those present to genuflect after the bishop utters the initial prayer and then to get up. The prayers include a request that purity rise up in this place, since this crowd of people that turba agree to hold fast to their vows. And the rite ends by requesting the Lord to grant the request for restoration of purity to the crowd of people making it. It's also a rite which emphasises the bishop's authority. Only he can preside over this rite. Only he can reconcile this space. And the gospel reading, with its reference to the basis for petrine and therefore episcopal claims to authority, reinforces that point. So, although this is a collective rite in which bishops, clergy and people all call on the Lord to cleanse this space and make it sacred again, the church and or cemetery is restored as a space suitable for the community of the living and the dead. The rite in the Magdalene Pontifical represents the culmination of a series of liturgical changes across the later 8th, 9th, 10th and 11th centuries, and its origins go back to late 8th century Francia. The earliest evidence for a rite, for some sort of rite for the reconciliation of holy places that I'm aware of, is the presence of two prayers under the rubric the reconciliation of an altar where homicide has been perpetrated. And that rite is found in at least two examples of sacramentaries which were compiled independently of each other in northeast France in the late 8th century. And one of them is this beautiful and splendid manuscript, the Goslar Sacramentary. I'm afraid these images aren't this particular rite, they're just ones I could get hold of, but they're just to give you a taste for what this manuscript looks like. Now, a sacramentary is a book which includes only those texts a priest needs for celebrating the Eucharist, for administering sacraments and presiding over the daily hours or office, together with other events like baptism. So the entry under this particular rubric consists of just two prayers. The first begins Deus indultorum criminum, and it goes on to talk about the treachery of the devil and then to request that God cleanse the altar of all pollution and restore it. The second, Deus quies bonitas, requests God to restore the polluted altar and rebuild that which has been contaminated and damaged by past faults. And versions of both these prayers are found in all later examples of this rite known to me. And they demonstrate how the need for reconciliation was envisaged from very early on as a counterpart to the dedication of a church, because these prayers are copied next to those for the dedication of a church in these examples. However, we don't actually have a detailed account of the reconciliation rite from the 9th century. The Carolingian group of sacramentaries, sometimes called the Gregorian sacramentaries, include a mass on the reconciliation of a church, such as you see in this sacramentary from Tours, but no prayers or any other indication of a separate rite for the reconciliation of an altar or a church which has been contaminated by becoming the site for an act of violence. Records of the full rite itself do not appear anywhere in the Latin West until the 10th century. And when they do so, they appear first in England. In fact, it's possible to trace the evolution of a specifically English rite in England across the next 2 centuries, from the mid-10th to the mid-12th century. Before we do so, however, I think we need to acknowledge that the decision to record a rite is a very deliberate and self-conscious one on the part of medieval churchmen. And we need to ask why, in this predominantly oral society, rites were written down. That may seem like an obvious question, but it's often been neglected because these aren't simple guides to support worship. You don't need that in a society which values memory. Written records of rites instead serve several different and overlapping purposes. They may be instruments for meditative reflection on a theme, instruments for instruction, or for exercising authority, saying this is how I think you should do it. They're not actually service books in the way perhaps that we understand them. Tracing how the particular rites were recorded and revised thus allows modern scholars to trace the evolution of ideas, and at the same time we can trace intellectual connections as we look at how texts travel across between different churches. Okay, I want now to return to the English evidence for the rite for the reconciliation of violence to churches. And I think there are really 4 main stages for this. The first stage is found in 2 10th century manuscripts, which both have connections to the Church of Worcester. These are now known as the Claudius Pontifical I and the Egbert Pontifical. And although they're copied in the later 10th century, they seem to be based on earlier 10th century texts. Now, pontificals are collections of those rites reserved only to the bishop. So rites like those for the ordination of the clergy, the dedication of altars and churches. Some pontificals survive from the 9th century, but as a genre, it really flourishes from the 10th century onwards. And the rite found in both Claudius I and Egbert is in many ways quite conservative, because what we see happening is them combining the 8th century Frankish tradition of 2 prayers with the 9th century Frankish tradition of a mass under a single rubric, the reconciliation of sacred places where blood has been spilt or homicide perpetrated. And you can see that in the example from the Egbert Pontifical. So the decision to extend this rite to reconcile holy places rather than just holy altars, I think is a reflection of a Carolingian development, which was to talk about how you need to separate the dedication of churches from that of altars. And here you can see these two ideas being brought together into a single all-purpose rite. The most obvious change from the Carolingian inheritance in the English tradition is that this rite was also extended to include the reconciliation of cemeteries. And you can see that change happening in the Egbert Pontifical. So if you look at this example, where I've ringed it in red, you can see that there is an interlinear gloss. And that interlinear gloss, above the word Ecclesia, is written the word polyandrum. Now, polyandrum is a pretty unusual word. It's found in various early medieval West Frankish hagiographical texts from the 7th century onwards, to where it means cemetery. So here we've got evidence that somebody familiar with a West Frankish text or a West Frankish environment is amending this English text copied in the late 10th century and adding in the possibility that this rite might not just be used for reconciling a church, but for reconciling a cemetery. The second stage in the development of this rite is found in the pontifical made for Dunstan, who was Archbishop of Canterbury between 959 and 88, and it's probably made in the 960s. And this rite includes for the first time an instructional set of rubrics to the bishop on how to conduct the rite. It says, the primate should sprinkle blessed water 3 times around and inside, saying these prayers. And the prayers which follow are those in the 8th century sacramentaries, together with a new one in which the minister requests God to sanctify this church or cemetery because he had already sanctified it. And you see that in the text ringed in red on the far right of the screen. So what we have here is that the copyist of the Dunstan Pontifical is envisaging including the cemetery within this rite right from the very point that he copies the manuscript. The third stage in the development of this rite is to be found in 2 later pontificals. Again, these are both linked to Canterbury and they were both copied around the year 1000. One is called now the Benedictional of Archbishop Robert and is now in the Bibliothèque Municipale in Rouen. I'm afraid I don't have a copy of it, but the other is now known as the Anderson Pontifical and it's in the British Library. And this is the manuscript that you have on the screen. The Anderson Pontifical in particular bears various marks that it was read closely by contemporaries. As you can see, it includes a number of marginal additions. These include a gloss right next to the first prayer by the introductory rubric and heading, and that gloss reads, the blessing, the benedictio of the cemetery where blood is spilt. And this gloss extends the rite explicitly to include cemeteries where blood has been spilt, although the rubric has not yet been updated to include cemeteries. At the same time, and in a very similar hand to that of the main script, you can see the annotator making reference to the singing of litanies and antiphons, and even including neumes with them. Now, the antiphons that are included here are those most commonly found in the English rites for the dedication of churches. But why are these antiphons being added into the margins and who's doing it? it's very common to find chants included in small script in pontifical rites, as on the right of the screen, underneath the rubric for saying this is for the Mass on the Reconciliation of Church, you've got the initial chants in a small script, and then the prayers and the readings from the Book of the Apocalypse in a larger script. That large script is for texts where the bishop is expected to take the lead, whereas the small script is for chants where the wider community of clergy supporting him will be involved. Okay, so that's what you would expect antiphons to look like in this rite, but they're being put and added in the margins. So who's adding them? Well, I think we have to recognise that this sort of rite is not part of the normal routine day-to-day business of a cathedral, and that if as we've seen already with the reconciliation of Canterbury after Becket's death, it's a rite which requires some planning. The cantor, the man in charge of the choir, was the one who would be tasked with really working out how this rite should be performed. And he's therefore the one who's most likely to have had to consult the text to consider, well, how are we going to perform it? And the additions, I think, here in the margins of antiphons to be sung are therefore evidence that we have a cantor giving thought to how this rite is going to be delivered. And that in turn is sort of hints at the fact that this is a manuscript that's actually used, and that this is a rite that is intended and was actually used. This isn't just an idealisation of, if we have a rite for dedicating a church, we need a rite for reconciling it. This is more evidence that they actually did this. Okay. So far, therefore, it seems clear that these rites were amended and updated across the second half of the 10th century and into the early 11th century. Each time, provision was made to expand the rite to incorporate the possibility that sacred space which might be violated might include the cemetery as well as the church itself. The final major change in the evolution of the reconciliation rite in England into a version similar to that in use in mid-12th century Canterbury came, in fact, in the mid-11th century in a pontifical made for the last Anglo-Saxon bishop, Stigand, probably, which is now in Cambridge, Corpus Christi College, MS 44. This rite included elements from the Romano-German rite, which seems to have developed independent of that in England in 10th century East Francia. But the English rite departed from the Frankish Romano-German rite in one very major way. The Frankish-German Romano-German rite specified that having blessed the water, salt, wine and ashes for exorcism, the bishop should go around the church 3 times on the inside, splashing the blessed water about, singing an antiphon and a psalm in order to wash and purify the contaminated places. It didn't say anything about the outside. The English version of this rite, as in Cambridge Corpus Christi College MS 44, specifies that the bishop should go 3 times inside and 3 times outside the church or cemetery, splashing the water to be purified the contaminated places. And you see that here at the bottom on the left-hand side and going up to the top right. He goes round 3 times. Go round outside 3 times, reflects a peculiarity of the Anglo-Saxon consecration rites, which specify that the bishop lead 3 processions around the exterior of the church rather than the more single one, which you find in the Frankish Romano-German tradition. And so here we've got evidence in a rite which is combining Romano-German with English elements that the indigenous English tradition remains extremely strong. So, this review of the liturgical evidence for the reconciliation rite should, I hope, have made clear the following 2 points. First, that the cathedral communities of the 10th, 11th and 12th century southern England rework this material again and again, incorporating new elements from the Frankish tradition, adding marginal notations as in the Anderson Pontifical, or interlinear additions as in the Egbert Pontifical, or as you can see here in the Corpus Christi College MS 44, that what they've done is to add alternate multiple readings above the line so that this could be right for the reconciliation of one place or 2 places. And when we're thinking about what places will have 2 cemeteries, for example, we're then thinking about monastic spaces, which will have a lay cemetery and a cemetery for the monastic community. And that reworking is, I think, a testimony to an ongoing interest in this rite. So that's the first point. My second point is that these communities copied rites from the second half of the 10th century onwards, and that when they did so, you can see them extending the remit of these rites to include cemeteries. What I want to do now is to come on and briefly explain how this interest in the liturgy for the reconciliation of churches was echoed in church law. The medieval English church inherited a very rich legacy of Roman secular and canon law. The idea that a place or building should be regarded as holy has very deep roots in Roman law and in early Christian doctrine and practice. In the Roman Empire, the terms dedicatio and consecratio denoted a formal juridical procedure by which a site, a temple or a grave, was removed from secular use and became subject to divine law. And this idea that certain sites should be set apart as divine was carried over into early Christianity. At the same time, Roman law upheld the idea that such places should be inviolate. It condemned the violation of graves, for example, as a capital offence, and this teaching was taken over into medieval church law. The contested nature of Christianization itself also posed new challenges. First, as a consequence of the debates as to what constituted orthodoxy, late antique churchmen were asked to legislate on whether, and if so in what circumstances, a church might need to be reconsecrated. The Council of Carthage, around 400, enjoined that if there was any doubt about whether a church had been consecrated, then it should be consecrated. And this teaching was taken up and repeated in canon law collections in the 9th, 10th and 11th centuries. But how was it to be consecrated? And what if the church in question had previously been in the hands of schismatics or heretics? Was that heretical consecration valid, or did it need to be redone? So those are the sorts of problems that are recorded in late antiquity and which continue to be recorded in later medieval collections. But to this set were added a new set of related problems, and they are particularly articulated in this pair of canons which you see on the screen. And they travel together as a pair. So the first is, if the altar has been moved, the church should be consecrated anew. And the second, if the church was violated by homicide or adultery, it should be cleansed most diligently and consecrated anew. Now, the earliest Anglo-Saxon record of these two canons is from the early 11th century. It's in a collection compiled by Archbishop Wulfstan of Worcester and York, which now survives in a manuscript in the British Library, which has been termed by its most recent editor, Michael Elliott of the University of Toronto, as the Collectio Vigorniensis, and this is the version A3. But the earliest record anywhere is actually about half a century earlier, and it comes in a copy made in the South German Bavarian Bavarian church at Freising, which was a copy of a 6th century collection, the Epitome Hispana, and you can see this these two canons in this manuscript by the red line. It then, from Freising, seems to have moved to Worms and been copied by Burkhard of Worms, who compiles the best-selling collection of canon law that bishops need throughout the 11th century. So what we can see is that these two canons are being created and copied from the second half of the 10th century onwards, first in Germany, then in England, and that is the point when churchmen in both kingdoms seem to become interested in prescribing that churches which have been violated by sinful acts should be cleansed and consecrated anew. And for that they need a rite, so it's not surprising that we get rites appearing in the second half of the 10th century, that the law and liturgy, the records go together. So to summarise, the evidence of the liturgical rites and canon law, when taken together, suggests Anglo-Saxon bishops and their clergy at Canterbury and Worcester became particularly interested in the rite for the reconciliation of holy spaces which had been violated, and in extending this rite to include cemeteries around the year 1000. And in the last part of this paper, I therefore wish to consider why Anglo-Saxon churchmen began to pay attention to the rite at this time and in this way. I should start by saying bishop murder was extremely rare throughout the Central Middle Ages. It's not unknown before Becket, but it's always rare. But churches, the courtyards in front of them, which were part of the sacred space, the cemeteries next to them, these are all sites for activities which concern Christian authorities in this period. They might be as simple as people chatting in churchyards, which churchmen legislated against, but they also are clearly risk and can be sites for acts of violence and be subject to destruction. So if we take the first example, which is the St. Brice's Day Massacre. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records how Evrard ordered that all Danish men who were in England were to be slain on November the 13th, 1002. And this event is now known to modern historians as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. What this meant in specific terms is made clear in the records of St. Friedwide's Church in Oxford. These include a charter issued by Ethelred in 1004 in favour of St. Friedwide's, and that charter records how on St. Brice's Day 1002 a group of Danes sought sanctuary in the church, whereupon the townspeople who were chasing them burnt the church down and killed the Danes in it. As a consequence, all the community's records went up in smoke. hence the need for a new charter. Now, in 2008, archaeologists discovered in St John's College a mass grave of 35 men who had died by acts of violence sometime between 960 and 1020, according to the carbon dating. And so archaeologists have linked that grave to this massacre. So what we have in these skeletons is very tangible evidence that churches could be and were subject to considerable violence in this period. Sadly, liturgical texts are not as amenable to radiocarbon dating when it comes to tying them precisely to historic events. Even if we can't link rites to particular events, it's worth observing that stories reported in miracle accounts, chronicles and letter collections from across England, northern France, the Low Countries and East Francia, point to how churches and their precincts were often the sites of violent acts in this period. Around 1020, the subdean of Chartres, for example, was murdered in the court in front of the cathedral as he was coming to church one night. And this was a cause célèbre as the Bishop of Senlis had organised this assassination together with his mother and brother because they thought the post should have gone to the brother. Now that's a great story. It reveals a good deal about tensions over family control of cathedral offices. We know about it because of the letters that Fulbert, Bishop of Chartres, wrote criticising and trying to take action against the Bishop of Senlis. But what it also reveals is that such courtyards in front of cathedrals were not only public spaces, but also dangerous ones. Nor was the inside of a church safe, and we see that in an account written by Lambert of Hersfeld about a dispute between the Bishop of Fulda and the Bishop of Hildesheim, which took place at the King's Court in Goslar in 1062 in Germany, and it took place at Whitsun. And we're told that the Bishop of Hildesheim was unhappy about an incident which had occurred at court the previous Christmas, in which his claim to sit closest to the Archbishop of Mainz at Vespers had been ignored in favour of the Abbot of Fulda. And in order to prevent the same seating plan being enacted again, the bishop therefore arranged for one of his counts, a certain Egbert, to hide behind an altar with several knights. When it became clear that the bishop's claims were again being challenged by the Abbot of Fulda, as far as the seating plan was concerned, Egbert and his men leapt out and began fighting the abbot's men with cudgels and drove them out of the church. The men of Fulda then gathered their weapons and returned, bursting into the church during Vespers as the brethren were singing psalms in the choir, and started fighting, this time with swords, causing, according to Lambert, rivers of blood to run through the church. The Bishop of Hildesheim therefore urged his men, as if with a war trumpet, to fight bravely. The young king tried but failed to call an end to the fighting and eventually had to withdraw with some difficulty to his nearby palace. And we're told that at least 2 men, one on each side, were killed in the ensuing melee, the standard bearer of the Abbot of Fulda and one of the knights of the Bishop of Hildesheim. Now the men of Hildesheim were again victorious, and Fulda's men were chased out of the church. Again the Fulda men regroup, fetch their weapons and appear armed and in great numbers, occupying the churchyard drawn up in a battle line, and we're told that the whole incident only ends when night time comes. And next day, you have a massive investigation under royal auspices. And the end result was that the abbot was blamed because he was claimed that he had come prepared to fight. And that although the bishop had started it, he'd come prepared for a fight with a large force. And he and his footmen were forced to pay punitive fines to the king to retain their offices, and these were so steep that they impoverished the abbey for years to come. Now, Lambert is a monk, he's cynical, and he sees this as episcopal persecution of monks. He sarcastically describes how the Bishop of Hildesheim was a bishop of apostolic sanctity and Mosaic gentleness, who had consecrated his hands to God with so much bloodshed and avenged the injuries of the profaned church more savagely and more inexorably than the king avenged his own injuries. The language, that of the profaned church, I think hints at the liturgical and ecclesiastical discourse which must have accompanied these events, because they would have necessitated the reconciliation of the church subsequently. So these three incidents demonstrate that churches could be and were the location for violent clashes between armed men, attacks on armed men, or attacks by angry mobs. Nor were such clashes confined to laymen, as both the Chartres and Goslar incidents suggest. Churchmen themselves, even if they did not take part in the violence directly, were often accused of being its instigators. And these stories therefore provide a context for this ecclesiastical interest in creating a liturgy for the reconciliation of such violated places. To put it simply, through administering such a rite, bishops were able to reassert their authority as arbiters of a sacredness at a time when it was challenged. Their position as leader was articulated from the moment they processed with the crowd in front of the church at the beginning of the rite, and reinforced as they physically cleansed and purified the boundaries of the Holy Church by processing round it with holy water. The readings in the Mass which followed also allowed bishops to describe the church as a new Jerusalem, and in doing so it helped them to reassert their own authority in setting the church and cemetery apart from lay society at a time of friction. So the ways in which 10th and 11th century churchmen responded to violent attacks have come under a lot of scrutiny from scholars. They've traced how monks responded to attacks on and invasions of church property through the recitation of long, elaborate liturgical curses, through which are called a monastic clamour, and also through elaborate rituals in which they humiliated saints' relics, placing them on the floor. We have people, including myself, have investigated how bishops had recourse to excommunication of enemies in defence of their property, and how bishops and monks came together in the Peace of God councils from the end of the 10th century to articulate and defend the defenceless, clergy and the poor, women and children, from violent attack on persons and property. And what I would suggest is that the rite for the reconciliation of sacred places where blood has been spilt should be added to this list. The extent to which such defensive actions are a result of and reaction to a time of political transition and the weakness of royal authority, particularly because so many of them are concentrated in modern-day France, West Francia, has been the subject of considerable debate. The marked monastic bias of much of this evidence has been rather less discussed, and much of this research has relied on charter, legal and narrative evidence, where it investigates liturgical sources, such as those for the clamour and humiliation of relics. They tend to be exceptional texts, rather than the sorts of texts I've been discussing, which are copied routinely in liturgical collections. And so what I would suggest is that the rites for the reconciliation of sacred places where blood has been spilt helped provide a useful corrective to this monastic Francocentric picture. For these rites are found next to rites for the dedication of churches in pontificals copied across the Latin West. On the one hand, they are both normative and routine, but they shouldn't be ignored, as I hope I've convinced you they are a result of a particular point in time and they point to particular changes. First, as a rite which is found across the Latin West, they signal that such defensive ritual action was not confined to French monasteries, but was much more widespread. Second, as episcopal texts, they highlight how bishops as well as monks drew on liturgical rituals as a way to assert their authority. Third, in the way they are extended to include cemeteries as well as churches as sacred spaces, they draw attention to the way in which the extension of spiritual authority over cemeteries was still a new phenomenon in the early 11th century. And we have various examples of groups accused of heresy challenging the idea that the dead need to be buried in a Christian cemetery, or that they need and to come under episcopal and ecclesiastical governance. Now, that change is not, the move to cemeteries in particular is not a sudden but a very gradual process. But finally, to return where we began with the reconciliation of Canterbury Cathedral after Becket's murder, the reason why it was so delayed was because papal guidance was sought. But the community of Canterbury sought guidance not because it was an unprecedented situation requiring a new ritual solution, but rather because of the absence of an archbishop. For this is a rite which both supports and articulates episcopal authority, and through its history also points to wider changes in Christian society. Thank you.